Hello everyone and welcome back to another installment from our webinar series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. Your company needs to share its environmental performance with stakeholders and may need to report climate disclosures. Find out how ESP's BraveGen software makes it easy for Stride property to understand and report on emissions from its asset portfolio. Join Sharyn Bramwell-Reweti, Safety and Sustainability Manager at Stride, to hear how the company measured its emissions, set a base year and target, and is tracking its performance in line with the approach of the Science Based Targets Initiative. Sharyn joins Dan Tomlinson, Head of Markets and Partnerships at ESP. Dan explains how ESP software manages carbon data and sustainability reporting. thinkstep-anz's Barbara Nebel hosts the webinar and will explain why understanding your sustainability metrics is good for your business. Here's a sneak preview.
So under the SBTI tool, there were quite a few different options that we could follow, and there's currently changes around the real estate area that we could have also undertaken. However, after working through the options and discussing it with ThinkStep, we landed on following the absolute carbon contraction approach for Scope 1 and 2, as we're a small to medium enterprise with less than 500 employees. The use of consultants to assist with developing our targets and creating the decarbonisation plans, along with the data and supporting evidence which gets uploaded into the system, provides a backup to the sustainability statements that we make each year and hopefully avoids us being accused of greenwashing, as the statements and information can all be verified. And having the data in one place makes it much easier to meet the New Zealand and international requirements around reporting, around information availability.
Really key points, sort of circling back to where Barbara started, is around that flexibility. So the ability to have partners or tools that can adapt to changing needs as the focus shifts from risk and mitigation towards transition planning and adaptation. So making sure you've got the right skills and tools, people around the table to react appropriately, anticipate what's coming next.
Can you explain how and where BraveGen get their emission factors?
We load emission factors from different libraries. So either working with our team, we can load them, or if you've got someone like ThinkStep who've got access to specific emission factors, they can load them in.
With that, let's get started.
We've got two guests today. We have Sharyn from Stride and Dan from ESP sharing their thoughts with us as well. So we've got a three-way conversation going today. Very much looking forward to it. So I will start with a little bit of an overview of what to actually look in a tool, because today is all about measuring and reporting your environmental performance. It could possibly even be more than just environmental. There could be other indicators too, but let's just focus on one. Most people would probably want to focus on carbon, but we see sustainability reporting, environmental reporting a little wider than that generally. I'm really, really happy to have Sharyn Bramwell-Reweti here, the Safety and Sustainability Manager at Stride Property, and she will share her story on carbon reporting and how she uses the tool as well. And we've got Dan Tomlinson here. He's Head of Markets and Partnerships at ESP, and we'll give a little more insight on how they work at ESP and probably even talk a little bit about a specific tool. Before I hand over to Sharyn and Dan, I just thought I'll share with you, we've been around the space for a while, so what to actually look for in a tool. I thought I'd share with you what my favorite tool is. And it's not an Excel spreadsheet. And I am slightly biased. So this is my favorite record-keeping tool. It has a lot to do with carbon too, but we won't get into that. Well, why do I like that as a tool? There are quite a few advantages here. You can see it covers a whole long period, but it's automated. Every year, automatically, you don't have to do anything. Every year, an extra record is added, just fully automated. So you want a tool that is as automated as possible. It's also really consistent. It just reflects what's happening. The methodology is the same throughout. So you want consistency in historic data and methodology. You want secure data storage. You could have an electricity failure. This data will still be stored. There is no problem. You want it to be reliable. doing the same thing every year. You wanted to cover a whole range of indicators. And the indicators in this case are slightly limited, but they are, has there been a lot of rainfall? Has there been a drought? Has there been some other natural catastrophe? Was there a fire? How close were the trees next to it standing? Has there been, suddenly it gets more room, it can grow faster. So a whole range of indicators. It's internationally understood and it's been around for a while. So it's a proven tool. You really don't want the tool that just been invented last week. You want something that's proven and out there. So I think these are all advantages, but it could work better in some other areas. So what you also want in a tool is ease of use. And I realize that my tool could be easier to use. It does require expert knowledge. And yes, you'll have experts using it, but you also really want it to be easy. You want it to represent a whole number of sites so that you can go site-specific and drill into your data. And our tree can't do that. It will tell you everything about that one site, but you want it to be wider. You want it to be really flexible so that it can adjust. You want to add indicators. You might want to add, I don't know, health and safety indicators as well. You want to be able to access it from anywhere. You want dashboards that can be integrated in reports, and you want it to support your targets. So possibly even be forward-looking. And the tree won't be able to do that. So there are better tools out there. And Sharyn will now tell us a little bit about how she is using a specific tool, which I'll tell you what it is. No spoiler alert here. And I'll hand over to Sharyn right now.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Sharyn Bramwell-Reweti ingoa, and I'm just getting this in there. So just a little bit about Stride. We're a New Zealand NZX listed property company, combining both property ownership through Stride Property with real estate investment management business, which Stride Investment Management, or SIML as we call it. We have 3.4 billion assets under management as at 31 March 2023 across office, retail and industrial. And 2.3 billion of those assets are external assets under management. Our structure, we are listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange as a stapled security with both Stride Property and SIML. SIML was the property management arm, and through management agreements, we manage Stride Property Limited, which has directly held office and town centre portfolios, Industry, which is an industrial portfolio in a joint venture with JP Morgan, Diversified, which is shopping centres and has 2 Australian pension funds as its investors, and Investor, which is a large format retail, so supermarkets, large hardware stores, and that is also NZX listed. So when we started building our system, we needed it to meet all our different needs. And some of the key requirements was the ability to record at not just asset level, but also at fund level, portfolio level, and also to capture our head office emissions. We needed to be able to easily capture changes in each fund, and these included when we buy and sell properties externally, and also when we sell them internally to other funds, also managed by Stride. And when we sell internally, we still need to capture the information, but attribute it to the correct fund. We needed to be able to capture multiple types of consumption data, so data from multiple suppliers, from multiple tenants, and in multiple formats. So the data configuration we needed was to allow us to be able to upload data without much change from the suppliers. And I understand this is set to become even easier in the future. We also need to be able to add in one-off items, so such as embodied carbon when we develop a property, employee commuting, and those sort of things. Just recently, we've been needed the ability to record both market and location-based electricity data and using the different emission factors. So the Ministry for the Environment emission factor for location-based and the NZECS, I think that I've got that correct, for the market-based emissions. We also needed a tool that allowed us to do multiple reporting requirements to meet our benchmarking, investor reporting, greenhouse gas emissions reporting. and also something that would allow us to share data easily with other investors, such as our joint venture partners, and also with our tenants. So we used the BraveGen, ESP's BraveGen tool, and this screenshot just shows how it captures all the data across all scope 1, 2, and 3 assets and our head office emissions. It shows where we were at our base year, 2 years ago, and 1 year ago, the movements, in both scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And scope 3, as you can see, is by far and away our largest emissions that we have. It has been set up so that we have our, at the top, we have Stride, then under Stride, we have the different portfolios, it's diversified in Fabric, and under Fabric, we have each of the individual assets that relate back to that fund. So it can cascade all the way down. And at each, and apologies for the small font size in this one, but at the asset level detail, you can put basically what you need to for your organisation in there. So at scope 0, where there's no emissions, we've added in things like our gross floor area and our net lettable area. We've put in our refrigerant installation total amounts where we've got them, and that's obviously where things like our recycling goes as well. And in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, the items that go in there are dependent upon what is in place at each property. For the scope 2, we separate the electricity components out to meet our benchmarking reporting requirements. And so we just needed to make sure we understood what we needed to get out of the system prior to setting up the system so that we could easily change it and get the data out as we needed to. So we used the tool to set targets, and we have established science-aligned targets to reach net zero by 2030 in scope 1 and 2. And we've done this with the assistance, and I might say a lot of assistance from ThinkStep. We spent quite a bit of time understanding what was required for the science-based targets and identifying why this is the approach that we should follow. ThinkStep did quite a bit of work for us in the background, looking at what our emissions were, how we came about the emissions, and what would be the best approach. So under the SBTI tool, there were quite a few different options that we could follow, and there's currently changes around the real estate area that we could have also undertaken. However, after working through the options and discussing it with ThinkStep, we landed on following the absolute carbon contraction approach for scope 1 and 2, as we're a small to medium enterprise with less than 500 employees. And we've done that based on scope 1 and 2 at the moment because that's the data we have the most data of and the most comprehensive data. Scope 3, we've been collecting data since 2020, but it's been gradually building up, and we still don't feel we quite have enough full data to be able to set targets to reduce it going forward. So the ThinkStep worked with the data that we had to develop the baseline. That involved having to capture all the changes from the purchases and sales of properties since 2020, our base year. And we used our FY23, so our reporting year is 1 April to 31 March. So we used our FY23 data as we identified that to be the most, the least impacted data, least impacted by COVID on our properties. And so it gave us a better idea of what we needed to re-baseline back to 2020 for those new purchases and sales. So the outcome was a target to reduce emissions, scope 1 and 2, by 42% from 2020 to 2030, 4.2% per year reduction. So in addition to the scope 1 and 2, we've also developed other targets, such as removing the R22 refrigerant from properties, and we can identify where we've got that because we've already put that in our system. We can use our data that we've got to identify current energy and water consumption and emissions and how we can reduce those. And our data has also been used as a basis for our decarbonisation plan. One of the key things that we have to do is share our data, and stakeholder requests have ballooned since we first began this journey back in 2020. So some of the key reporting requirements include, obviously, progress against targets. We have 2 funds that are required to report under the mandatory climate reporting related disclosures reporting. And so that includes our greenhouse gas reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3 data. And BraveGen allows our auditors to get into the system, access the system, and look at whatever they need to look at in there, rather than us pulling out data dumps and sending it through to our auditors. We're also able to provide metrics such as the kilowatts of energy per square metre net legible area. We don't do it by building, but we can do it by fund. The benchmarking that I've sort of alluded to throughout this is our global real estate sustainability benchmarking. And that is that's what required us to set up the system to meet this reporting requirement, as well as the greenhouse gas reporting requirement. And we do 3 different GRESB reports each year. We have multiple investor requests, and these often have a different reporting period to Stride. So, for example, there might be 1 July to 30 June or 1 January to 31 December. And the BraveGen systems allows us to pick and mix against these reporting periods so that our investors or the entities that are asking us the questions can get the data that matches their portfolio that they need to do for their own reporting requirements. And then we can pull out tenant requests when they ask us for our scope 1 and 2 for the buildings within which they are tenants. So this is just an example of a quick snapshot of the asset spreadsheet that we have to report to BraveGen in. They require 2 years of data for every building across multiple areas such as energy, greenhouse gas emissions, water and waste, and that's at every single asset level. And so one of the key parts of the system was getting this right. So we had identified a property as either base plus tenant, so multi-tenanted, or tenant only for a single tenanted property. And then that allows us to pull the reporting out quite simply. So the following slides are just a few examples of reports that Stride currently uses. This one shows total greenhouse gas emissions across financial years and the breakdown between how the emissions were created: electricity, refrigerants, stationary energy. It's not split out by scope, so it just gives a total amount. This one shows at the top the fund, one of our funds, the data for 1 year, and across multiple years split out into scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and the different types of emissions, so electricity, refrigerants, and stationary energy. And then the bottom graph shows the same thing, but just for a single building within that portfolio. And this only shows the data from 2021, as that was when this fund was actually established. The data can also be exported via tables, and so you can pull the table down, export it by Excel and CSV, and then that allows you to create your own graphs, use the data to do the reporting in your own way if it's not already set up. So for the scope 3 data, stuff that we currently collect is our business travel, downstream leased assets. So that's all our tenant electricity and gas, and waste. We do water, we do the waste where we're responsible, transmission and distribution losses, and employee commuting. And we're currently working with thinkstep on our upstream purchased goods and services and embodied carbon. So we've really only just started in the last couple of years to get really good information, particularly from our tenants, which downstream lease tenants is by far and away our biggest emission across our whole portfolio. And it's really challenging to collect. We need to get data from the tenants or permission to access their suppliers and get the data. So our scope 3 upstream purchased goods and services, we're currently working with thinkstep to identify the emissions based on spend and based on spend by each fund. And the next steps will be to work with our larger suppliers to capture their data more accurately and identify how we can work with them to reduce emissions. Embodied carbon is also a large piece of work that we're starting to embark on, and that includes primarily data from our new developments, as well as any major repairs and maintenance projects that we may undertake. And thinkstep has done quite a large amount of work in this area in developing embodied carbon calculator for the New Zealand Green Building Council, which is the tool that we're looking to use to do this. So the scope 3 data is captured in multiple ways. We can get it through invoices, we can get it through emails sent by our tenants, we can get it through tenant spreadsheets, and they do it in their own particular way. And we also are able to upload all of those plus our one-off emissions as well. So what have been some of the key outcomes? We've built up a credible database of emissions and resource use over the last 4 years, nearly 5 by the end of this year. And the data that we have has support a number of projects, such as our transition plan. So we're developing a decarbonisation plan for our retail and office properties. This plan looks at ways to transition our portfolio to net zero to meet our SBTi targets. And this is looking at how and when we remove our gas boilers and what the change in emissions factors will mean, using more efficient electricity systems and looking at introducing renewable energy onto our sites. We've used the emissions data tool from BraveGen and implemented it into a separate tool to start assessing the implications of climate risk on each individual asset and what that might mean for us as an exposure to our climate risks or physical climate risks around business interruptions, cleanup costs, and so on across a number of scenarios. The use of consultants to assist with developing our targets and creating the decarbonisation plans, along with the data and supporting evidence which gets uploaded into the system, provides a backup to the sustainability statements that we make each year and hopefully avoids us being accused of greenwashing, as the statements and information can all be verified. And having the data in one place makes it much easier to meet the New Zealand and international requirements around reporting, around information availability. So Stride continues to develop and expand the capturing and understanding of our emissions, in particular Scope 3. And working with thinkstep and ESP's BraveGen system has made this much smoother than if we tried to do it all alone. With the amount of data that we need to capture, a streamlined system and experts to help us in this area that I believe are essential. So I'll now hand you over to Dan, he's from ESP.
Sharyn, so I'm just going to do 2 quick slides. The first one is just sort of how the model between our 3 parties works. So essentially Stride has that overarching governance responsibility. So they're bringing the operational knowledge and have ultimate accountability for what is actually reported. ESP and thinkstep are just working to support that. So our software serves as the single source of truth. We also provide some data management resource and can provide metering, monitoring, and verification services if that's needed. thinkstep are clearly the subject matter experts. So they're bringing their breadth of expertise and experience to inform strategy and provide technical guidance. And last slide here. So, a couple of comments on where we see the market right now. So the last 18 months have really been about Scope 3 disclosures. And we're seeing a lot of companies thinking about regulation and risk. So organizations needing to meet mandated disclosure requirements or just requests for increased transparency from stakeholder groups. But we see that a lot of time is being spent on reporting when we actually want to be moving forward on decarbonisation. So organizations needing to inform and execute on transition plans. So as sort of Sharyn mentioned at the end there, reporting requirements are only going to continue to increase, and we need to continue to support the efficiency of reporting, but organizations are going to need even more and better data to inform decisions, support business cases, underpin investments, so forth. So really key points, sort of circling back to where Barbara started, is around that flexibility. So the ability to have partners or tools that can adapt to changing needs as the focus shifts from risk and mitigation towards transition planning and adaptation. So making sure you've got the right skills and tools, people around the table to react appropriately, anticipate what's coming next. And that's it for me. So we have time for questions. How do we account for zero carbon products where offsets have been used? So Scope 3 purchase goods and services or capital goods, can it be a zero count? Barbara, my understanding of that is you still have to report the emissions, but you can report the offsets elsewhere.
Correct.
Right, Barbara?
So it's still your emissions, but if you want to offset all your emissions, you don't have to offset those emissions that come from a, I would say, certified zero carbon product or carbon zero or whatever certification system it is. You don't have to offset those again, but they are still your emissions and need to be accounted for.
Next one here from Nicola. She'd like to know in the system how to get those fund and asset reports. So Nicola, I think come talk to email me or support about what you're looking for, because some of those features have been built in our BI tool. So we can talk to you about how to get those things built and represented in the system. Nicola's got a clarification. So our reports from BraveGen written for your needs, or are they standard? It's both. So we have a set of standard reports But oftentimes we find that, intensity ratios are an excellent example. That tends to be custom to the sector or industry that someone's in. So we create custom elements off of standard reports. So yeah, we do both essentially. And Aaron, relationship between ESP and BraveGen. Yep. So ESP is a company in New Zealand that helps businesses measure, manage, and reduce their emissions. ESP is the company. BraveGen is our software brand. So Sharyn is using BraveGen, the software. ESP has some additional services around decarbonisation. We do neighbors ratings and things like that aren't related to software.
Can you explain how and where BraveGen get their emission factors?
We load emission factors from different libraries. So either working with our team, we can load them, or if you've got someone like thinkstep who've got access to specific emission factors, they can load them in.
And a specific question for Sharyn. How much of the Stride approach here is driven by mandatory requirements from government or regulation versus board and investor questions?
We initially started before we had to do any of the mandatory reporting, and in particular around the greenhouse gases and the science-based targets. We were on the path to doing those, and they slot into the climate-related disclosures. So it actually works quite well hand in hand. The climate-related disclosures, I think we did our first greenhouse gas report before we even had to do those. So it was something that the board chose to pursue. Investors got much more interested, and the board got much more interested. And then we've got the mandatory requirement, which sort of underpins it all as well. And as everyone may have been noticing around the world, it's becoming more and more of a mandatory requirement everywhere.
Does BraveGen have access to many Asian emission factors? We don't have. We load the libraries and emission factors that we need to. So we have access to public emission factor databases, or we can work with customers to try and find the emission factors that we want. It's not a proprietary emission factor database that we have. Is ESP suitable for embodied carbon calculation? We don't have a specific carbon calculation module or widget, but that's where we're working with experts like thinkstep to sort of use the data collection capabilities of the tool and the methodology expertise that thinkstep had to sort of do LCA approaches. Barbara, perhaps you have a comment there?
I can probably also an additional comment to the previous one. If we, for example, have access to other emission factors that are freely available, we can also help and work with BraveGen to put those into, or with ESP to put them into the BraveGen tool, to get the terminology right. And with regards to your embodied carbon calculation question, so embodied carbon comes in two ways. In your corporate carbon footprint, that might come in under your purchase goods and services or your capital, depending on what type of business you are. So we can help with finding the right emission factors there, but we also do a lot of detailed embodied carbon calculation on specific buildings. Again, that can help with your scope 3 as well. Do lots of LCA work, and if out of that LCA work we would come up with an emission factor for specific product, or with an emission factor that we need, or result that we need for your scope 3 use of sold goods, then that can also be fed back into the BraveGen tool as the right emission factors or as the right activity data. So it is more on it's not automated, but a lot of the work we do can interact with what the BraveGen tool can do. Is NZ leading the way in regards to reporting, or is it much the same for Australia too? Leading the way possibly with when it comes to putting some regulations in place. Otherwise, leading where? Leading in the world? No. Yeah. I would put that to Europe. Leading with regards to Australia, maybe New Zealand is slightly ahead, but difficult to say.
So I spent the last week in Sydney and Melbourne talking to folks there. In Australia, they've got a lot of experience with scope 1 and 2 because of their INGRS regime, similar to our ETS, but there's still ESP standards have to be defined with regards to how deep in scope 3 they're going to go. So New Zealand companies are sort of leading on scope 3 for sure. But as Barbara sort of said, yeah, compared to Europe and other places, still got some catching up to do.
Yeah. So can you give examples of offsets? I'm a little bit picky on the wording here. So if I might just, what you want is credits, and you do then offset. So it's probably examples of credits that can be used for offsetting, rather than no one can buy an offset. You can buy a credit, and with that you can offset your emissions. Sorry, sometimes the academic in me comes through. Examples, there are two categories largely. There are the removal credits, as in, for example, forestry, they actually remove carbon, or there are credits that are having
Avoidance.
Exactly, the avoidance ones. Sorry. So if you replace a coal-fired power plant with a wind farm, for example, that's a replacement one or avoidance one. Or if in developing countries you put efficient ovens out instead of having just an open fireplace to cook your food, you could have used just a third of the fuel used. So those are the avoidance credits. So those are valid, but if you want, in the context of a science-based target, the last 10% that you can't reduce, they have to be removal credits. Along the way, the avoidance ones are good. We need those. But in order to get to net zero under a science-based target, those last have to be removal credits. I can take the last one. Is there an update on the 2007 MO2 emission factors? Coming. We're working on it. We've got a draft. My colleagues told me it will be this year, and the end of the year is coming fast. So fingers crossed that we actually are able to do that. But yes, there will be an update. And
we're looking forward to those.
I know a lot of people are. Well, we are over time. Thanks for everyone for staying here, asking lots of questions. I always like good interactive webinar. Very special thank you to Sharyn and Dan for sharing your stories and insights. And we are looking forward to seeing you at the next ones. So we will have at least one more webinar coming, and you'll find it in the usual spaces. So very much looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks again, Sharyn and Dan. Have a wonderful afternoon.